Hi, welcome to this tutorial on Windows Communication Foundation. So this is a series of tutorial. In this series of tutorial, we've been seeing about how to create a service, implement a service, and how to configure the endpoints and using an application app.config file and use in the code also. Okay. So in my previous tutorial, we finished with how we can do all the configurations in the code as well as in the app config file. Okay. So in this tutorial, we will be seeing on binding configuration. Okay. And how we can do the binding configuration in app config file as well as in code. Okay. So this is my email ID, Darni Grace. Sorry, Grace at gmail.com. So if you have any queries, please feel free to put your queries or your suggestions so that I can to my email ID. Okay. So binding. So what is actually binding? Okay. So address tells in an endpoint we have three values: address, binding, and contract. So address gives the address of the endpoint where it is located in the service. Okay. And binding tells us about the message. Okay. So it gives us some information on how the message has to be sent and received, has to be sent and received. Okay. So some informations like whether it has to be in a text format or it has to be in a binary format, mm, and whether it has to be encoded and so on. Okay. And the second one is the transport. Okay. What kind of a transport should be used? Whether it has to be a HTTP or TCP, or it has to be a name pipe, I mean IPC, okay, or MSMQ. Okay. And the third one is it tells on what kind of a security we have to use, what type of security we have to use. So all these informations are given inside a binding. Okay. And the third one is contract. Contract tells us about what operation we have to do. Okay. So we clearly saw on contract, okay, how to give the service contract, data contract, so everything we saw. So now we are going to focus on binding. Okay. So WCF has a preset of bindings. Okay. Like we have basic HTTP binding, WS HTTP binding. Okay, we have a set of bindings. Okay, and these binding have their own properties, have their own characters, and based on the requirement, developer's requirement, the developer can choose the particular binding they want to. Okay, for example, the bindings are basic HTTP binding. Okay, so the transport mode is HTTP mode, but it doesn't have any security. Whereas if the developer feels that they want to go for a HTTP binding with the security, then they can go for WS HTTP binding. Okay, so the data is in encoded format. Okay, and next we have net TCP binding. So this is mainly used for intranet communication, and then we have named pipes. So named pipes are if both the service and client are in the same system, then we go for named pipe binding. So we have a huge number of binding. Next we have MSMQ. Okay, MSMQ binding is mainly used when the service is not up and running at all the time. Okay, so sometimes there can be a service failure or the service is not up. Okay, in that particular period, if the client is sending message and the message is very important, that the client cannot afford to lose the message. Okay, so if the developer is going to use the MSMQ binding, then the message that the client is sending will be stored in a MSMQ server, backup server. Okay, and once the service is up, okay, or the server is up, it will retrieve the messages which are in the MSMQ server, and it will start processing it. Okay, so this is one type of binding. So WCF gives a list of bindings with their with its own characters. Okay, but if you say that still you're not happy with bindings, or if you want some other requirement, if you have some other specification, okay, in that case you can go for a custom binding. Okay, you can create your own binding and you can use that binding. Okay, so we will see how we can configure a binding, that is, say if I'm going to give ws http binding in my endpoint. Okay, and this binding has its own default values. Okay, but if I have to change some of the default values, then how will I do it? Okay, so you can do it in coding, or you can also do it in your app config file. Sorry, so we will see how to do that in app config file first. Okay, so I open the same demo serialized program. Okay, so we created a host in a console application, and here I have my app config file. So before doing anything, I'll just check whether my service is up and running. Yeah, so my service is up and running. Okay, so there are two endpoints here. So the first endpoint is for metadata, publishing the metadata, and the second endpoint is for binding. Okay, so what kind of a transport I'm using? Okay, it is ws http binding. Okay, so suppose if I say that I want to change some of the properties in this binding, I don't want to, or if I want to add some properties to this binding, I want to change the default values. Okay, so in that case, what I will go is I will do is I will give a binding configuration, and I will give it as my config. It is my own configuration that I'm giving for this ws http binding. So after I give this, I have to give the bindings element. So inside the bindings element, so you're going to give your own configuration, or you're going to set the default values for ws http binding. So you have to choose ws http binding, and inside that I have binding. Okay, now you have to give the name. What name? It is my config. Okay, and now I give the value, I give some properties here. So allow cookies, I'm setting it to true, and close timeout, I'm setting it to, I'm just giving some time span. Okay, so some of the properties you can change, for change the default values, okay, of these bindings in your binding configuration file. We will just check whether it is running. Okay, actual effect of these properties you can see once you consume it using your client. Okay, so for time being, we will just see whether we have given this correctly. So we will just run it. Okay, get to the config file. So I just, sorry, just a second. Okay, there should be some. Oh, okay, okay. So I'm just given here a C as capital. Okay, okay. Okay, file save all. Just on this. Oh, okay. There we go. Okay. So I just made a small mistake here. Okay, it's case sensitive, so I just gave the C here as an uppercase, but here I give it as a lowercase. Okay, so that was error, it was shooting up. Okay, so now my service is up and running. There is no change in my allow cookies or anything, because I have to have a client to consume it, and most of these properties will be effective on the client side. Okay, so just that we are seeing how we can change the default value for the WS HTTP binding using a app config file. So the same thing you can do it in your coding also. So I will go to my other project which we did for just coding. Okay, so I will close this, and here I have another. Okay, so here completely we are hosting using the code. Okay, we don't have anything in the app config file. So okay, so we don't have anything in the app config file, but we are have done all the things in the coding. Okay, so what is the binding I've used here? It is basic HTTP binding. So what I have to do is I have to go for a binding configuration. So I've created an object of type basic HTTP binding, and I call that, I use that instance and call the properties. So allow cookies is equal to true, and binding one dot um, close timeout is equal to new time span of 00 comma 10 comma 0. Okay, so I've given some time span here around 10 minutes, and I've set the allow cookies equal to true property. So whatever I was able to do in the app config file, okay, I can do it in the coding also. So file save all, and run the project. Okay, so again my service is up and running. There is no change. You cannot see anything. Most of these properties you will not be able to see the effect on the service side. Okay, maybe if we are able to do some changes for the binding in the client side, we should be able to see some changes. Okay, so this is about how we can do our own binding configuration, both in the app config file as well as in the coding. So thank you for watching this tutorial. I will catch you up in the next tutorial wherein we will see how to give service behaviors in coding as well as in the app config file. Thank you once again.